The Americans called it suicide. Australians called it standard patrol. American military advisors watched the 5 Australians disappear into the jungle and shook their heads. Suicide mission. No reserves, no fire support, no backup plan. 5 men against an entire Viet Cong regiment operating in territory so hostile that American battalions refused to patrol there without artillery preparation and air support on standby. The Australians carried nothing but their weapons, a radio, and enough supplies to survive for 2 weeks in conditions that would kill most soldiers in 3 days. Pentagon liaison officers filed reports expressing concern about reckless Australian operational methods that violated every principle of sound military doctrine. 3 years later, those same officers were desperately trying to understand why Australian Special Air Service patrols achieved kill ratios exceeding 30-1, while American long-range reconnaissance teams suffered casualty rates that made their missions the most dangerous assignments in Vietnam. This is the story of how professional soldiers proved that sometimes the most dangerous option is also the safest. The first Australian task force established itself at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tue province during April 1966, creating an operational presence that would continue for 5 years. Located southeast of Saigon, the province occupied territory measuring approximately 1,000 square miles of varied terrain, including rubber plantations, rice paddies, jungle-covered mountains, and scattered villages. Unlike American units operating under Military Assistance Command Vietnam coordination, the Australians established an independent area of operations that allowed development of tactical approaches distinct from the massive search and destroy sweeps characterizing American operations elsewhere in South Vietnam. This arrangement reflected both practical considerations about command relationships and Australian confidence in their own tactical doctrine developed through experience in previous counterinsurgency campaigns. 1RAR's initial deployment with American forces throughout 1965 had highlighted fundamental differences in how each nation approached the war. Australian and American military leaders subsequently agreed that Australian combat forces should be deployed in a discrete province, allowing the Australian Army to fight their own tactical war independently of American operational control. This suited both parties. The Americans needed Allied forces to demonstrate international support for South Vietnam, while focusing their massive deployments on operations across the broader theater. The Australians wanted freedom to apply methods they believed would prove more effective than the approach General William Westmoreland pursued throughout South Vietnam. Westmoreland's strategy of attrition rested on assumptions drawn from American military experience in 2 world wars and Korea. American forces conducted large-scale search and destroy operations designed to locate enemy concentrations, fix them in place, and annihilate them through overwhelming firepower from artillery, tactical air support, and heavy bombers. Multi-battalion sweeps moved through suspected enemy areas, supported by massive artillery preparation and tactical airstrikes. Success was measured through body counts, with detailed tallies of enemy dead reported up the chain of command after each operation. The underlying assumption held that sufficient enemy casualties would eventually force North Vietnam to abandon its objectives in the south and accept a negotiated settlement preserving an independent non-communist South Vietnamese state. The American approach generated massive firepower, but achieved limited lasting results in what became a frustrating pattern visible across South Vietnam. Operations would sweep through an area with battalions supported by artillery and tactical air, engage enemy forces in sharp firefights, inflict casualties measured in hundreds that were meticulously counted and reported, then withdraw to conduct operations elsewhere according to theater-wide plans that emphasized maintaining offensive momentum through constant pressure on enemy forces. The Viet Cong would avoid battle unless conditions favored them, dispersing before American forces arrived and waiting for the inevitable withdrawal before returning to areas they had temporarily abandoned during the sweep. Villages that appeared secure immediately after American operations would return to Viet Cong control within days or weeks of the departure of conventional forces. By 1967, despite overwhelming American force deployments that numbered more than 400,000 troops with sophisticated equipment and unlimited firepower support, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces initiated 90% of large firefights, according to studies analyzing combat patterns, retaining strategic initiative that allowed them to choose when and where to engage American forces on terms that often favored the insurgents who knew the terrain intimately and enjoyed support or at least acquiescence from significant portions of the rural population. Australian battalion commanders viewed this approach with skepticism, born from different operational backgrounds. Their measures of effectiveness focused on denying enemy freedom of movement, separating the population from Viet Cong influence, and establishing sustainable security. The contrast became apparent to observers on both sides. Westmoreland reportedly complained to Major General Tim Vincent that the 1st Australian Task Force was not being aggressive enough according to his standards. The Australian emphasis on patrolling, on searching villages without destroying them, on establishing ambushes and cordon operations appeared insufficiently violent compared to American doctrine. The Pari doctrinal divide ran deeper than simple disagreement over tactics. It represented fundamentally different conceptions of what the war was about and how it could be won. American strategy assumed that inflicting sufficient casualties would break enemy will and force political concessions. Australian thinking, informed by experience in Malaya during the emergency throughout 1948 to 1960, held that counterinsurgency required patient application of pressure designed to separate insurgents from population support while establishing government control that could be sustained after foreign forces departed. 3 Squadron of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment arrived at Vung Tau via Saigon on June 16, 1966. Moving to Nui Dat the following day to begin operations that would continue for the next 5 years as squadrons rotated through Vietnam on year-long deployments. The squadron included approximately 120 personnel, organized into troops of around 30 men each, according to standard SAS structure. These troops deployed in patrols of 4 to 6 soldiers, most commonly 5-man teams that balanced operational effectiveness with the need for stealth in jungle operations where larger groups would compromise the silence and concealment that made reconnaissance possible in enemy-dominated territory. American liaison officers reviewing Australian operational plans focused immediately on the patrol structure. 5 men, sometimes 4. Occasionally, for the most sensitive reconnaissance missions, just 3. These numbers violated fundamental principles that American military doctrine held sacred based on experience accumulated through decades of warfare. American long-range reconnaissance patrol units operated in platoon strength or larger, 30 men minimum, often more. The logic seemed straightforward and was validated by combat experience. More men meant more firepower, more security, more options if contact occurred. Mass and mobility. Concentrate force and overwhelm the enemy. These were lessons written in blood across battlefields from Europe to the Pacific to Korea. Lieutenant General John H. Hayes, Jr., who commanded the 1st Infantry Division from February 1967 to March 1968 and later became Deputy Commanding General of 2nd Field Force, assessed that long-range reconnaissance patrols were generally considered to have the most uncomfortable and dangerous job in Vietnam. American commanders understood the necessity of these missions while recognizing their exceptional danger. A platoon-strength patrol had reserves, fire support within the unit, ability to sustain casualties and continue the mission. The mathematics of survival seemed clear. The Australian approach rejected this calculus entirely based on different assumptions about how reconnaissance operations should be conducted in jungle terrain against an irregular enemy employing guerrilla tactics. A 5-man team had no reserves that could be committed if the patrol made contact with superior enemy forces during operations deep in hostile territory. A 5-man team had no fire support within the unit beyond what the individual soldiers carried on their backs, lacking the machine gun teams or mortar sections that could provide suppressive fire while other elements maneuvered to break contact. A 5-man team had no ability to sustain casualties and continue operations successfully, because losing even 1 man to enemy fire reduced combat power by 20% and fundamentally altered the patrol's capabilities, while losing 2 men created a catastrophic reduction that would force immediate mission termination regardless of operational requirements. If they made contact with a larger enemy force under circumstances that prevented immediate withdrawal to extraction points. Basic military mathematics based on firepower ratios and force concentration suggested they would be annihilated through simple numerical superiority before extraction helicopters could arrive or supporting artillery fires could be brought to bear on enemy positions threatening the patrol. American advisors were appalled. This was suicide, they insisted during coordination meetings and in reports filed through liaison channels. The methods violated every principle of sound military doctrine. The predicted outcome seemed inevitable. High casualties, mission failures, patrols overrun by numerically superior enemy forces. The Australians smiled politely at these objections and continued preparing for operations according to their own doctrine. The men who stepped off those helicopters at Nui Dat on June 17, 1966, brought backgrounds that suggested different conclusions about what constituted sound tactical doctrine in jungle warfare. The Special Air Service Regiment traced its lineage to British special operations traditions developed during the Second World War while drawing on the heritage of Australian Second World War commando units, including Z Special Force and the independent companies that had operated behind Japanese lines in the Pacific. Formed in July 1957 as the first Special Air Service Company of the Royal Australian Infantry, the unit was modeled on the British SAS, with which it shared the motto, "Who dares wins." Expanded to full regiment status in August 1964. The organization consisted of 3 Sabre squadrons, a base squadron, and a signals squadron headquartered at Campbell Barracks in Swanbourne, a suburb of Perth in Western Australia. Active service began in Borneo during 1965 and 1966 as part of British Commonwealth forces deployed during the Indonesian confrontation. President Sukarno's campaign to destabilize the newly formed Federation of Malaysia through military infiltration and support for insurgent movements in Sarawak and Sabah. Australian SAS troopers operated alongside their British and New Zealand counterparts in operations aimed at stopping Indonesian infiltration across the long, porous border separating Malaysian territories from Indonesian Kalimantan, where Indonesian regular forces and trained infiltrators attempted to move into Malaysian territory to support insurgent groups and establish bases for further operations. The mission required long-range patrols through some of the most challenging jungle terrain in the world, where dense triple canopy rainforest created conditions of perpetual twilight even during midday, where navigation required constant attention to prevent patrols from becoming hopelessly lost in wilderness that appeared identical in every direction, and where the heat and humidity created physical conditions that could incapacitate soldiers who lacked proper acclimatization and training. Patrols lasted weeks or months, operating independently beyond any support from conventional forces, with one documented operation by British SAS continuing for 89 consecutive days without resupply or extraction as the patrol conducted reconnaissance across vast areas of trackless jungle, gathering intelligence about Indonesian positions and movements. The soldiers learned to sustain themselves in conditions that killed the unprepared within days through dehydration, heat exhaustion, tropical diseases, or the countless hazards that dense jungle presented, moving through the environment while maintaining silence that prevented enemy forces from detecting their presence. Reading terrain for signs of enemy presence through careful observation, establishing ambush positions along infiltration routes, and extracting themselves when compromise seemed imminent or when they had gathered the intelligence their mission required. The Borneo operations came at a cost. 3 Australian SAS soldiers died during the campaign. One was gored to death by a wild elephant, suffering agonizing wounds that took days to kill him in the remote jungle far from medical assistance. 2 others drowned during a river crossing when the current proved stronger than anticipated, and their equipment loads dragged them under before their patrol mates could reach them. Despite often being deployed in the reconnaissance role, SASR units inflicted at least 20 kills on Indonesian forces through ambushes and contacts conducted on both sides of the border, in operations that remained classified for years after the conflict ended. The training pipeline creating these soldiers reflected institutional understanding that special operations required extraordinary investment in personnel development that could not be abbreviated or rushed without compromising the capabilities that made these forces effective in roles conventional units could not fill. Selection tested volunteers through physical ordeals specifically designed to push candidates beyond normal human endurance limits, and through carefully calibrated psychological stress that revealed how individuals responded when exhausted, hungry, cold, deprived of sleep, and subjected to sustained pressure that mimicked the stress of combat operations where decisions had to be made under extreme duress. Navigation exercises conducted over impossible terrain in foul weather, forced marches carrying excessive loads, swimming tests in cold water while fully clothed and equipped, interrogation resistance training that tested mental fortitude. The selection course threw every conceivable challenge at candidates to identify those rare individuals who possessed not just physical stamina, but the mental resilience and tactical aptitude needed for extended operations in small teams operating independently under extreme conditions far from supporting forces. The course winnowed applicants ruthlessly without sentiment or second chances, rejecting the majority of volunteers regardless of their performance in conventional infantry units or their demonstrated courage and competence in normal military operations, where different attributes mattered more than the qualities special operations demanded. Physical fitness was necessary, but insufficient for success in the course. Mental resilience mattered as much as strength and endurance. The ability to continue functioning effectively when exhausted beyond normal limits, to maintain sound judgment when stressed and operating on minimal sleep, to work effectively in small teams under conditions of extreme physical and psychological discomfort, to adapt to constantly changing circumstances without detailed orders from superiors. These qualities could not be taught through instruction, but could be identified through properly designed selection procedures that revealed character under pressure. Those who survived selection through demonstrated possession of these essential attributes proceeded to the patrol course, where they learned the specialized skills distinguishing SAS operations from conventional infantry tactics that emphasized very different capabilities designed for very different missions. The complete training pipeline from selection through operational deployment could take more than a year of continuous instruction and evaluation. Soldiers who completed the process represented an investment the Australian military could not afford to squander through careless employment or missions beyond their capabilities. The regiment drew on expertise from multiple sources to develop its operational methods. Aboriginal trackers in northern Australia had taught skills in reading ground sign and moving silently through dense vegetation. British SAS instructors who had served in Malaya during the emergency shared lessons about jungle warfare and counterinsurgency operations. Australian veterans of the Second World War contributed knowledge about operating independently in hostile territory far from conventional forces. This accumulated expertise created institutional knowledge about reconnaissance operations that went beyond what American forces trained primarily for conventional warfare in Europe possessed. New Zealand contributed personnel to each Australian squadron beginning in late 1968, with SAS troops integrating seamlessly into combined ANZAC operations. The New Zealanders brought their own expertise and shared the workload of continuous operations that demanded sustained effort from limited personnel. The partnership reflected long-standing military cooperation between the two nations and distributed the operational burden across a slightly larger force structure. Based at SAS Hill on the Anui Dot feature overlooking the task force base, the squadrons built facilities and prepared for operations unlike anything American forces conducted in Vietnam. Preparation began weeks before insertion and reflected understanding that reconnaissance in hostile territory required transformation as complete as it was systematic. The Viet Cong would come to call them Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle, a nickname that reflected both respect for their capabilities and fear of soldiers who seemed to materialize from nowhere, strike with devastating effect, and vanish before retaliation became possible. Becoming a phantom required abandoning habits and routines that marked soldiers as outsiders in the environment they would inhabit for days or weeks at a time during patrols that would penetrate deep into territory where Viet Cong forces operated with confidence born from years of controlling the area. 1 week before insertion into operational areas, soldiers stopped smoking tobacco in any form. Cigarettes, cigars, pipes, chewing tobacco, all banned during the preparation period. Tobacco created distinctive odors that carried on the wind for surprising distances and announced presence to enemy forces patrolling the same jungle or manning observation posts along likely infiltration routes, warning alert sentries that foreigners moved through the area even when visual contact remained impossible through screening vegetation. The smell of American or Australian tobacco products was immediately recognizable to Vietnamese fighters who had spent years in the jungle and knew which scents belonged and which announced the presence of enemy forces. 3 days before deployment into operational areas, soldiers stopped using soap, shampoo, toothpaste, deodorant, and any other Western cleaning or hygiene products. These items contained perfumes, fragrances, and chemical compounds that left scents entirely foreign to the Vietnamese countryside, creating olfactory signatures that could alert observant enemy soldiers to the presence of intruders who did not belong in the environment, and whose foreign smells announced them as clearly as visual sighting would have done. As the mission date approached, diet shifted systematically from Western rations, featuring meat, potatoes, bread, and familiar foods, to rice, fish, sauce, vegetables, and other items that composed typical Vietnamese meals. The goal was simple in concept, but unsettling in its implications for those who truly considered what it meant. They wanted their bodily functions, their sweat evaporating in the oppressive heat, their breath exhaled during the exertion of movement through difficult terrain, their very skin and the oils it secreted, to smell like the Vietnamese countryside itself. Like farmers laboring in rice paddies, like villagers moving through the jungle, gathering firewood or hunting small game. Like the enemy themselves, patrolling through their home territory. If a Viet Cong soldier positioned in an observation post caught a whiff of patrol members passing nearby through dense vegetation where visual contact was impossible beyond a few meters, that enemy fighters should smell the familiar odors of Vietnamese rural life rather than the foreign scents that would trigger immediate alarm and investigation that could compromise the patrol's position and lead to contact under disadvantageous circumstances. Equipment underwent equally extensive modification to serve the specific requirements of reconnaissance operations in hostile territory, where standard military issue designed for conventional infantry combat would compromise mission effectiveness. Standard issue jungle boots, pride of American military engineering with their reinforced construction, heavy-duty soles, drainage ports designed for tropical conditions, and ankle support for carrying heavy loads were discarded like useless relics from a different kind of warfare. The boots were excellent pieces of equipment for conventional infantry operations where durability and foot protection mattered most. But they created distinctive tread patterns in soft ground that trained enemy trackers could identify and distinguish from civilian footwear or the simple footwear Vietnamese peasants wore. And they produced noise when moving through dense undergrowth, filled with dead leaves, fallen branches, and vegetation that rustled and cracked under the weight of soldiers wearing heavy boots. The noise could alert enemy forces positioned in observation posts or conducting their own patrols to the presence of Australian soldiers moving through areas that should contain only Vietnamese civilians or Viet Cong forces who knew the jungle intimately. In their place, Australian troopers laced simple canvas tennis shoes or running shoes purchased commercially. Footwear that allowed nearly silent movement through the jungle, without the distinctive military tread patterns and without the noise of heavy boots crushing vegetation with each step. The shoes wore out quickly in the harsh conditions of jungle operations where sharp rocks, thorns, and constant moisture destroyed canvas and rubber. But they could be easily and cheaply replaced from local markets or through supply channels. And they provided the stealth that mattered infinitely more than durability for missions where detection meant almost certain death if the patrol could not break contact and escape before enemy forces could concentrate superior numbers against their position. Weapons received particular attention. The L1A1 self-loading rifle, standard infantry weapon for Australian forces, was cut down and adapted for special operations employment. Flash eliminators were removed to reduce barrel length. Wooden furniture was stripped away and replaced with custom grips. Most significantly, armorers modified the weapons to fire on full automatic despite the rifle's standard semi-automatic only configuration. 30-round magazines replaced the standard 20-round versions, giving patrols sustained firepower if contact occurred. These modifications served tactical purposes that became clear only when considering the contact doctrine these patrols would employ, if discovered. Dennis Mitchell, who served with 2 Squadron and 3 Squadron from November 1968 to September 1969, later explained the philosophy in interviews with historians. Running away saved more lives in Vietnam of SAS men than anything else, he noted with characteristic Australian directness. The way patrols would run away involved putting so much fire downrange and making so much noise that the enemy would wonder what they had bumped into and hesitate before pursuing. Modified SLRs capable of full automatic fire, combined with M16 rifles and M60 machine guns, created overwhelming volleys that simulated forces far larger than 5 men. Each patrol carried communications equipment, including PRC-64 and PRC-77 radios that allowed encrypted transmissions to task force headquarters. Claymore mines, directional anti-personnel weapons containing 700 steel balls behind a curved explosive charge, provided defensive firepower that could devastate enemy forces attempting to overrun patrol positions. Grenades, ammunition loads sufficient for extended operations, rations, water purification equipment, and medical supplies rounded out loads that often exceeded 40 kilograms per man. Soldiers were heavily armed and equipped for sustained independent operations, balancing the stealth needed to avoid detection with the firepower needed to survive if compromise occurred. Movement through the jungle followed doctrine that seemed impossibly slow to observers accustomed to conventional infantry tactics, where speed, momentum, and rapid exploitation of tactical opportunities were emphasized as essential elements of successful operations. Patrols could take 9 full hours to cover a single mile of terrain, when operating in areas where intelligence reports and previous reconnaissance suggested enemy presence was likely. And the risk of contact with Viet Cong forces was assessed as high enough to require extreme caution in movement techniques and security procedures. They moved forward just a few steps at a time through the dense vegetation that limited visibility to a few meters in most directions, watching where each foot was placed to avoid stepping on dry branches that would crack and announce their presence, or disturbing vegetation in ways that would leave obvious trails for enemy trackers to follow, then stopped completely and froze in position. During these halts that could last 5 or 10 minutes, they listened intently to the surrounding environment for any sounds suggesting enemy presence in the area. Voices raised in conversation or command. Movement of equipment or weapons being handled by soldiers preparing defensive positions. Footsteps of patrols moving through the undergrowth on their own reconnaissance missions. The sounds of cooking fires being prepared or camp activities that would indicate enemy base areas nearby. They observed the jungle around them with systematic attention to detail, looking for visual signs of disturbance or recent enemy activity. Recently broken branches showing green interior wood rather than the gray of old breaks. Footprints pressed into soft ground near streams or in areas where rain had softened the earth. Bent vegetation marking the passage of patrol elements along trails that were being actively used. Fighting positions or bunkers indicating enemy defensive preparations that might reveal the locations of base camps or defensive perimeters protecting supply caches. After several minutes of this absolute stillness spent listening with complete concentration and observing every visible detail of the surrounding terrain, they would move again, perhaps another 10 or 20 meters, depending on how the terrain channeled movement and what routes offered the best combination of concealment and progress toward objectives, then repeat the entire process again. The discipline required to maintain this glacially slow pace hour after hour through exhausting heat that could exceed 35 degrees Celsius and humidity that made even minimal exertion feel like working in a steam bath. While carrying loads exceeding 40 kilograms through dense vegetation that seemed to actively fight against every step forward. Tested even the most thoroughly trained soldiers, whose selection process and preparation had specifically identified them as possessing exceptional physical and mental endurance. Impatience could kill. Haste created noise. Noise drew attention. Attention meant contact under circumstances that might not favor the patrol. Communication between patrol members occurred through hand signals and predetermined gestures. Verbal exchanges were conducted in whispers so quiet they could barely be heard by soldiers standing next to each other. Roger Hayden, a Navy SEAL with Team 1 who later spent 10 days operating with Australian SAS patrols, recalled the experience in interviews decades after the war ended. For the entire 10 days, the Australians did not speak a word, he noted, with a mixture of admiration and lingering disbelief. They used only hand and arm signals. Everything they needed to communicate passed silently between patrol members who had trained together long enough to understand each other's intentions without speech. Aboriginal tracking methods learned in Australia and refined during operations in Malaya transferred directly to Vietnamese jungle conditions with adaptation to local terrain and vegetation. Soldiers learned to read ground sign that revealed recent passage through an area. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, footprints in mud, bent vegetation, scuff marks on trees, all told stories to trained observers about who had passed, how many, how recently, and in which direction they traveled. The ability to distinguish fresh disturbance from old, to identify which trails saw active use and which had been abandoned, gave Australian patrols insight into enemy dispositions and intentions that observation alone could not provide. American observers watching these preparations reached unanimous conclusions about what would happen when these methods met combat reality. The consensus held that the Australians had adopted techniques guaranteed to result in their destruction during actual operations. American advisors who understood reconnaissance warfare from their own dangerous experience predicted that 5-man patrols operating beyond supporting range of artillery and quick reaction forces would suffer catastrophic casualties once the Viet Cong identified their presence, and concentrated forces to destroy them. Pentagon liaison officers documented these concerns in reports filed through official channels. The predictions seemed reasonable, based on everything American military experience suggested about small unit operations in hostile territory. American long-range reconnaissance patrol personnel from the 101st Airborne Division began joining Australian patrols as part of an exchange program designed to share techniques and build cooperation between Allied Special Operations Forces. The Americans arrived with expectations shaped by their own LRRP experience, which confirmed that these missions represented the most dangerous assignments available in Vietnam. Casualty rates for American reconnaissance teams validated the assessment that penetrating deep into enemy-controlled territory in small groups created exceptional risk. The insertion technique alone shocked American observers accustomed to different methods. Australian patrols approached landing zones at treetop height in helicopters that skimmed over the jungle canopy before descending rapidly into small clearings barely large enough for the aircraft. The approach minimized exposure time and reduced the likelihood that enemy forces would detect the insertion, but it required precision flying that left no margin for error. Pilots and patrol members worked in practice coordination, the helicopter settling just long enough for soldiers to exit before immediately climbing away. The first 5 minutes after insertion represented the most vulnerable period, when the patrol needed to move away from the landing zone before enemy forces that might have observed the helicopter could concentrate at the location. What happened next convinced American observers that they were witnessing something fundamentally different from their own operational methods. The Australian patrol would move perhaps 50 meters from the insertion point, then stop completely. They would remain motionless for 15 or 20 minutes, listening to the jungle sounds, allowing the environment to settle after the disruption of the helicopter, waiting for any indication that enemy forces were converging on their position. Then they would move again, perhaps another 30 or 40 meters, and repeat the process. Progress seemed agonizingly slow to Americans, trained to put distance between themselves and the insertion point as rapidly as possible. The silence was absolute and sustained in ways that defied American assumptions about what humans could endure. Days passed without verbal communication between patrol members. Hand signals conveyed necessary information. Predetermined actions at specific times eliminated the need for discussion. The discipline required to maintain complete silence for 72 or 96 consecutive hours while moving through hostile territory under constant threat of discovery exceeded anything American reconnaissance doctrine demanded of its personnel. Hayden would later tell fellow Navy SEAL veteran Jocko Willink that he learned more about reconnaissance during his 10 days with the Australians than anywhere else in the world, including the rigorous training programs American Special Operations Forces conducted. Their fieldcraft was so good, he stated simply, leaving the comparison to American methods implicit but unmistakable. Contact situations revealed the tactical logic underlying Australian preparation and movement doctrine in ways that validated methods American advisors had predicted would fail catastrophically when subjected to the test of actual combat against experienced enemy forces. When a patrol detected enemy forces through direct observation or by interpreting signs indicating recent passage through an area they were reconnoitering, the decision about whether to engage the enemy or avoid contact and continue observing depended entirely on circumstances prevailing at that moment and on mission requirements that had been established during the detailed planning process before the patrol ever inserted into the operational area. If the patrol's assigned mission focused primarily on intelligence gathering and the enemy force moving through the area had not yet detected Australian presence through visual contact or sounds that would alert them to the patrol's position, the soldiers would observe silently from whatever concealed positions they currently occupied or could reach without revealing themselves. document meticulously what they saw, including enemy unit size, types of weapons carried, direction of movement, apparent destination, and any other tactically relevant information that intelligence officers at Task Force headquarters could exploit. Then transmit their observations through encrypted radio communications that allow detailed reporting without enemy forces intercepting and exploiting the information to locate the patrol or understand what the Australians had discovered. The patrol would continue observing for as long as tactical circumstances permitted, and mission requirements justified the risk of remaining in position, gathering additional information that might reveal enemy intentions. Identify command elements whose locations could inform targeting decisions for artillery or airstrikes, or provide insights into enemy operational patterns that could be exploited through future operations by conventional infantry battalions working from the intelligence that reconnaissance patrols provided through patient observation, conducted at considerable personal risk. If engagement served tactical purposes because the enemy force represented a high-value target such as a known command element or weapons team, whose elimination would significantly degrade enemy capabilities, or if the enemy had detected the patrol's presence through chance observation or sounds that compromised the Australian position and contact became unavoidable. As enemy forces began maneuvering to locate and engage the patrol they knew was nearby, the response had to be immediate and overwhelming in its violence and shock effect. Modified weapons proved their worth in these moments. Soldiers would open fire with everything they carried, creating a wall of sound and lead that made the enemy believe they faced a force far larger than 5 men. The M60 machine gun would hammer out sustained bursts. Modified SLRs set to full automatic would pour rounds into the kill zone. M16s would add their distinctive crack to the cacophony. Grenades would detonate. Claymore mines would shred vegetation and anyone caught in their blast radius. The psychological effect often proved as important as the physical casualties inflicted. Enemy forces hearing such firepower frequently assumed they had encountered a platoon strength element or larger and responded accordingly, taking cover and calling for reinforcements rather than immediately pursuing. While the enemy hesitated, the Australian patrol would be moving, break contact and disappear. The jungle that had concealed the patrol during approach now covered their withdrawal. They moved through terrain they had already scouted, along routes they had identified during their approach, toward rally points established before the patrol began. The enemy, uncertain of Australian strength and reluctant to pursue blindly into jungle where additional ambushes might await, often allowed them to break contact successfully. The entire engagement might last less than a minute from first shot to final withdrawal. Extraction under fire became routine enough that soldiers developed the grim terminology, hard extraction, to describe missions that concluded with combat contact during the withdrawal phase. Helicopters would descend into landing zones, while patrol members provided covering fire, aircraft door gunners adding their weapons to the defensive fusillade. The aircraft would lift away the moment all personnel were aboard, often taking small arms fire from enemy forces, arriving too late to prevent escape, but close enough to engage during the vulnerable extraction phase. 3 Squadron made first contact with enemy forces during May, near the Nui Dat area, initiating a pattern that would continue for 5 years. The initial encounters validated tactical methods and began building the operational record that would eventually force American military leadership to acknowledge something unprecedented. Viet Cong forces operating in Phuoc Tue province represented formidable opponents with years of experience fighting French colonial forces and American-supported South Vietnamese troops. They knew the terrain intimately, maintained close connections with sympathetic villages throughout the province, and had developed detailed knowledge of trails, hiding places, and defensive positions accumulated over decades of irregular warfare. The Ma Rung moved through this environment as if they owned it. Patrols would observe enemy forces without being detected, gathering intelligence about unit compositions, movement patterns, and base camp locations. When engagements occurred, they followed the doctrine: overwhelming fire, immediate withdrawal, rapid extraction. During 3 Squadron's first tour in Vietnam, the unit mounted 246 patrols across 9 months of continuous operations. They killed 83 Viet Cong, according to confirmed counts, with an additional 15 listed as possible kills when bodies could not be confirmed due to the enemy's practice of withdrawing dead and wounded from engagement areas during darkness. The intelligence gathered enabled larger task force operations and provided commanders detailed understanding of enemy dispositions throughout the province. Australian casualty figures from this initial period seemed impossible by comparison with American reconnaissance unit experience conducting similar missions throughout South Vietnam, and where LRRP teams regularly suffered casualties that validated assessments about the exceptional dangers these operations entailed. 0 combat deaths during this first deployment. Through 246 patrols conducted in territory where Viet Cong forces operated freely and maintained secure base areas beyond the reach of Australian conventional forces, where enemy fighters knew every trail and village and enjoyed support or, at minimum, acquiescence from significant portions of the rural population. Not a single Australian SAS soldier was killed in action during contact with enemy forces, despite dozens of engagements where small patrols confronted larger enemy units, under circumstances that American doctrine suggested should result in the patrol's destruction. The statistic defied explanation based on probability calculations and combat experience from other reconnaissance units operating in Vietnam. 28 men were wounded during the deployment period across all 3 squadrons that rotated through Vietnam during this time frame, with injuries serious enough to require medical treatment and evacuation to surgical facilities, where doctors could properly treat gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and trauma that could not be managed in field conditions, but not fatal because the combination of immediate first aid provided by highly trained patrol members who had medical skills beyond what conventional infantry soldiers possessed, and rapid helicopter evacuation that could deliver even seriously wounded soldiers to fully equipped surgical facilities within 30 or 40 minutes of injury, meant that even quite serious wounds proved survivable when they would have been fatal in earlier wars where evacuation took hours or days. The disparity between these figures and American LRRP casualty rates demanded explanation. The Viet Cong recognized they faced something unusual. Intelligence reports revealed that enemy forces had begun using the nickname Ma Rung for the Australian reconnaissance troops, phantoms of the jungle. The name conveyed frustrated attempts to counter soldiers who appeared without warning, inflicted casualties, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Stories spread among Viet Cong units about encounters with the Australians. Some proved accurate. Others grew distorted through repetition. But the underlying current of respect mixed with fear was genuine. A bounty, reportedly worth $5,000 American dollars, was placed on each Australian SAS soldier. 1 squadron arrived in March 1967 to replace 3 Squadron and maintain the operational tempo. Patrols ranged throughout Phuoc Toi province and into adjacent areas, including Bien Hoa, Long Can, and Binh Toi provinces, as mission requirements dictated. The combination of stealth and lethality proved sustainable across hundreds of patrols conducted by different squadrons over years of continuous operations. 2 Squadron arrived in February 1968 during a period when Australian operations underwent evolution in response to changing command guidance. Brigadier Ron Hughes, who commanded the 1st Australian Task Force from October 1967 to October 1968, wanted the SAS to harass Viet Cong bases and attack their supply lines. The squadron began conducting Reese ambushes, where patrols carried out reconnaissance, then set ambushes on likely routes. These combined missions represented a shift toward more offensive employment. By month's end, 2 squadrons had completed 29 patrols. The evolving tactical employment reflected ongoing debate within Australian command circles about the proper role of Special Operations Forces in counterinsurgency warfare, where multiple objectives competed for priority. And commanders held different views about how best to employ limited special operations assets. Some commanders viewed high kill ratios achieved by SAS patrols as validation of offensive operations and wanted patrols to maximize enemy casualties through aggressive ambush tactics that exploited surprise. Others argued that the reconnaissance mission mattered more than body counts because the intelligence gathered enabled conventional forces to achieve results that reconnaissance patrols alone could never accomplish, regardless of how many individual enemies they killed. Major Reginald Patrick Beasley assumed command of 3 Squadron as it prepared for its second tours beginning in February 1969. A career SAS officer who had served in recruitment and selection roles before commanding an operational squadron. Beasley brought strong convictions about proper special operations employment to his position. Shortly after assuming command, he took an action that communicated his philosophy more clearly than any written directive. Previous squadrons had erected kills boards in their operations area, physical displays tracking enemy casualties that served as both scoreboard and morale booster. The boards reflected the competitive culture among elite soldiers and the natural human tendency to measure achievement through quantifiable results. Beasley physically kicked down the kills boards. The action was deliberate, public, and accompanied by explanation that left no ambiguity about his expectations. "We were not there to kill people, but to gain information," he told the squadron. The SA reconnaissance mission took priority over offensive action. If patrols could gather intelligence without engaging the enemy, that constituted success. If they could observe and report rather than ambush and attack, that better served the task force mission. Kills would happen when circumstances required or when tactical opportunity presented itself. But they were not the measure by which squadron performance would be judged. This command philosophy aligned perfectly with the operational requirements of 3 Squadrons' second tour. The squadron spent most of its time patrolling around the Mai Tao Mountains in northeastern Phuoc Tuy, an area that presented exceptional challenges for conventional operations. The mountains and surrounding jungle constituted a vast tract of terrain beyond the artillery and mortar range of Australian guns at Nui Dat. Viet Cong forces maintained secure base areas in this region, confident that the Australians lacked the capability to interdict their operations through conventional means. Infantry battalions could conduct sweeps through the area, but could not remain indefinitely without establishing fire support bases that would require extensive logistics and expose forces to attack during construction. The SAS mission became detecting and reporting Viet Cong routes through territory that could not be controlled through conventional military presence. Patrols would insert into remote areas, establish observation positions, and document enemy movements for days or weeks at a time. The intelligence accumulated over months of patient reconnaissance created detailed understanding of how Viet Cong forces used the Mai Tao region as sanctuary and staging area for operations throughout the province. In December 1969, the 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment and New Zealand forces mounted a month-long operation to clear the Mai Tao Mountains based directly on intelligence gathered by SAS patrols. The operation succeeded in disrupting enemy base areas and forcing Viet Cong units to relocate, achieving results that would have been impossible without the reconnaissance that identified exactly where enemy forces concentrated and how they moved through the complex terrain. Reconnaissance enabled action. Intelligence guided employment of conventional forces. Small teams gathering information in hostile territory created effects disproportionate to their size because they made larger forces vastly more effective. American military leadership observed these results with growing interest that gradually overcame initial skepticism about Australian methods. If reconnaissance patrols of 5 men could achieve such favorable outcomes while suffering minimal casualties, perhaps the assumptions underlying American LRRP doctrine required re-examination. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam Recondo School had been established to teach long-range reconnaissance patrol tactics to soldiers from divisions throughout South Vietnam. The school was run by the 5th Special Forces Group in Ha Trang, with students ranging from American soldiers and Marines to personnel from Allied forces, including South Vietnamese, Koreans, Australians, Thais, and Filipinos. The course required high levels of physical fitness and concluded with an actual combat patrol before graduation. Australian SAS personnel were assigned as instructors to the Recondo School and later to the LRRP Training Wing at the Van Keep Training Center beginning in 1967. The principles taught at Recondo School originated in the Australian Patrol course that SAS personnel completed before deployment. American students learned techniques that Australian soldiers had refined through operations in Borneo and were currently employing in Vietnam with documented success. Exchange programs expanded to include Americans serving with Australian units in the field and Australians attached to American SEAL teams and special forces throughout the country. Chris Roberts, who served with 3 Squadron during its second tour in 1969 and 70, experienced the cultural differences between Allied forces when he served as liaison officer to the 18th ARVN Division and later to the 199th American Light Infantry Brigade. He observed what he described as quite a difference in the way Australians and Americans operated. American forces attempted to replicate Australian results through comprehensive training programs and doctrinal adoption. But the sustained effort over several years revealed that techniques alone could not bridge the gap between the two forces' capabilities and operational outcomes. The differences ran deeper than procedural matters that could be taught in intensive courses lasting weeks or months, or absorbed through direct observation of Australian operations by American personnel serving with SAS patrols. The Australian SAS drew personnel exclusively from an all-volunteer professional force, where soldiers made careers spanning decades, rather than serving limited enlistments of 2 or 3 years before returning to civilian life and taking their accumulated experience with them. Soldiers entering the regiment expected to serve for 10, 15, 20 years or more, building expertise that compounded over time through repeated deployments and continuous operations that allowed lessons learned to be internalized and refined through practice. The American military in Vietnam, by contrast, depended heavily on conscription to fill its ranks, with draftees serving mandatory tours before returning home, and volunteers serving relatively short enlistments compared to the career-long commitment Australian SAS soldiers made. The 1-year tour policy that governed American deployments to Vietnam meant that experienced soldiers rotated home just as they had developed the knowledge and skills that made them most effective, creating constant personnel turnover that prevented units from accumulating and retaining expertise over multiple deployment cycles. Constant personnel turnover meant that units perpetually cycled experienced soldiers out of theater, while simultaneously integrating new arrivals who required months of adaptation to develop even basic competence in the challenging operational environment. Creating a continuous treadmill where expertise was constantly being lost through rotation, while being slowly and incompletely rebuilt through the painful process of new soldiers learning lessons that their predecessors had already mastered, but could not adequately pass on during brief handover periods. The selection and training pipeline that created Australian SAS soldiers represented an investment measured in years of continuous development. Soldiers who completed this pipeline were professional specialists whose entire military careers centered on special operations. American LRRP soldiers, by contrast, typically received several weeks of specialized training before deploying for their one-year tour in Vietnam. They might develop considerable expertise during that year, but they would then rotate home, and their experience would leave with them rather than accumulating within the unit over multiple deployments. Institutional culture enabling Australian success required time to develop and could not be quickly replicated through adoption of techniques or tactics. Professional soldiers who had served together through multiple deployments developed understanding that went beyond what training could create. They knew each other's capabilities and limitations intimately. They communicated through minimal signals because they had worked together long enough to anticipate reactions. They maintained discipline through exhausting conditions because their identity and career depended on meeting standards that volunteers accepted when they chose this path. From the arrival of 3 Squadron in June 1966 through the withdrawal of 2 Squadron in October 1971, 580 men served with the regiment in Vietnam. These soldiers conducted nearly 1,200 patrols across the 5-year deployment period. In 298 contacts with Viet Cong forces, they accounted for 492 confirmed enemy killed, according to official records compiled from patrol reports. An additional 106 were listed as possibly killed. 47 enemy soldiers were documented as wounded, and 11 prisoners were captured during operations and turned over to intelligence personnel for interrogation. Australian casualty figures stood in stark contrast to the damage inflicted on the enemy. 1 soldier was killed in action during contact with Viet Cong forces. 1 died of wounds after being evacuated to Australia, where he succumbed to complications despite medical treatment. 3 were killed in accidents during the deployment. Victims of the hazards inherent in operating helicopters and conducting training in hostile environments. 1 went missing in action during 1969 after falling from a rope extraction system into the jungle below. His remains not recovered until August 2008, when they were finally located and identified nearly 4 decades after his death. 1 soldier died of illness during the deployment period. 28 men were wounded in action, seriously enough to require medical treatment, though these injuries proved survivable. The kill ratio exceeded 30-1, the highest achieved by any unit on any side during the Vietnam War. Each squadron rotation, averaging 12 months in country, conducted between 230 and 245 patrols, accounting for between 83 and 151 enemy killed, depending on the intensity of operations during that particular period. The raw statistics, impressive as they appeared, in comparison to other units, understated the SAS contribution to Australian task force operations. Intelligence gathered on patrol provided commanders information needed to position conventional infantry units where they would intercept enemy movements. In September 1967, 1 squadron participated in Operation Santa Fe, a joint operation with American and South Vietnamese forces focusing on the Viet Cong stronghold in the Nui Mae Tao Mountains. Reconnaissance patrols identified enemy positions and movement patterns that guided the employment of larger forces during the operation. In July 1971, information gathered by 2 squadron patrols helped form the basis for Operation Iron Fox, a large hammer and anvil operation conducted by 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment and 4th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment with New Zealand elements. American military leadership studying these outcomes faced uncomfortable questions about the assumptions underlying their own doctrine. If 5-man Australian patrols operating for extended periods in hostile territory could achieve such favorable results while suffering minimal casualties, what did that suggest about American insistence on larger patrol sizes? If reconnaissance emphasizing stealth and intelligence gathering proved more effective than operations focused on maximizing enemy casualties, what did that reveal about the body count as a measure of progress? If professional volunteer forces showed superior performance compared to conscript units serving limited tours, what implications did that carry for force structure and personnel policies? The questions had no easy answers because they challenged institutional assumptions built over decades and validated through victory in 2 world wars. American military tradition emphasized overwhelming force and rapid decisive action. Australian methods seem to contradict this tradition by achieving effectiveness through small units that avoided decisive engagement whenever possible. The soldiers who executed these missions paid prices that statistics could not capture. Dennis Mitchell described the physical environment in interviews decades after his service. The heat in Vietnam felt different from Australian heat, despite similar thermometer readings, he noted. He attributed the difference to humidity levels that made 36 degrees Celsius feel far more oppressive than the same temperature would feel at home in Australia's drier climate. The tents soldiers lived in at Nui Dat had deteriorated badly by his second tour, many rotting in the damp climate and providing inadequate protection from rain when monsoon swept across the province. Equipment and uniforms deteriorated quickly in conditions that bred mold and corrosion. Minor cuts and abrasions infected easily in the humid environment. Psychological strain of maintaining operational effectiveness through repetitive, dangerous missions tested even thoroughly trained professionals. Patrols would spend days or weeks in conditions of absolute silence, hyper-vigilant for any sign of enemy presence, knowing that a single mistake could mean death for the entire team. The stress accumulated across multiple deployments. Terry O'Farrell, who completed 2 combat tours and went on 40 patrols behind enemy lines as a forward scout, platoon signaler, and eventually patrol commander, was wounded twice during his service. He would later write about the long, tense stretches on patrol in the jungle, ears ever alert to sounds of the surrounding terrain, the sudden shock of being caught by surprise when enemy contact occurred despite all precautions. Transition from combat to civilian life proved jarring for soldiers who rotated home after tours in Vietnam. Mitchell recalled that only 36 hours separated his involvement in a hot extraction under fire from landing in Sydney and returning to civilian life. The abrupt shift from hypervigilance and mortal danger to the mundane concerns of peaceful existence created cognitive dissonance that many veterans struggled to process. Some soldiers found the intensity of operations addictive, despite the danger. Mitchell told the story of Harry Harris, whose actual name was Ron, but who carried the nickname for reasons lost to memory. Harris had returned from rest and recreation leave to find that his regular patrol was already deployed on a mission. Rather than wait in camp for their return, he volunteered to go out with an unfamiliar patrol that had an opening. The boredom of life in camp proved less tolerable than the risks of operating with soldiers he did not know, as well as his regular teammates. After 5 years of continuous SAS patrolling, the Viet Cong finally became familiar with Australian insertion techniques. From June 1970 onward, it was not unusual for Australians to be fired on by enemy forces shortly after landing in an area. The Australian response showed adaptability. They developed cowboy insertions to counter the enemy's evolving tactics. In a cowboy insertion, the helicopter carrying the patrol was followed by a second aircraft with another patrol aboard. Both patrols would be inserted at the same landing zone and would travel together for 5 minutes. The second patrol would then stop and wait another 5 minutes while the first patrol continued its mission. If there was no contact with the enemy during this period, the second patrol would return to the landing zone where it would be extracted, having served as decoy and security for the primary mission patrol. Operational tempo began to decline during the final year of Australian involvement, as enemy forces withdrew from Phuoc Tue province under sustained pressure. One squadron's second tour, beginning in February 1970, faced the frustrating prospect of operations limited to reconnaissance tasks around Nui Dat as Viet Cong activity in the province decreased. Some patrols went months without enemy contact or sightings as the main force units that had operated throughout the province for years relocated to border areas or withdrew entirely to secure base areas in adjacent provinces. Patrols continued inserting deep into Binh Tue province during January 1971, extending operations beyond the traditional boundaries as mission requirements evolved. The last SAS contact occurred on February 4th, when a New Zealand patrol killed 2 Viet Cong northwest of Thua Tich during a routine reconnaissance mission. By this time, the advance party from 2 Squadron, which would conduct the final Australian SAS deployment in Vietnam, had already arrived to begin the handover process. 1 squadron departed for Australia on February 18th after completing its tour. On August 18th, 1971, the Australian government announced that the 1st Australian Task Force would cease operations in October and commence phased withdrawal from Vietnam. The decision mirrored political reality in Australia, where public support for the war had eroded as the conflict continued without decisive resolution, despite years of casualties and expenditure. 2 Squadron conducted the final SAS patrols in Vietnam, operating in Long Con province east and west of the Courtney rubber plantation during the closing months. The last patrol lasted 5 days from October 1st through 5th, 1971. The patrol made no contact with enemy forces during its mission, a quiet conclusion to 5 years of operations that had begun with such intensity and achieved such remarkable results. The soldiers returned to Australia, where 2 Squadron was disbanded as the regiment contracted to peacetime strength. The quiet end to SAS operations in Vietnam, with the final patrol returning without contact, symbolized how thoroughly sustained pressure over 5 years had reduced enemy capability to operate effectively in Phuoc Tue province. What Australian forces had achieved through professional application of sound counterinsurgency principles could not be sustained after their departure. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam lacked the training, leadership, and motivation to maintain the operational standards that had proven effective under Australian execution. Viet Cong forces that had been reduced to minimal presence in the province gradually returned to villages as AR-VIN units failed to maintain the pattern of continuous reconnaissance and ambush operations that had denied the enemy operational freedom. Control Australian forces established through 5 years of patient effort evaporated when the sustained pressure ceased. The province, like much of South Vietnam, eventually fell when North Vietnamese forces launched their final offensive in the spring of 1975, after American support ended and South Vietnamese forces collapsed under the combined weight of military pressure and political failure. The tactical lessons learned and proven effective in Phuoc Tue province endured far beyond the strategic failure that saw South Vietnam disappear from the map. Military institutions worldwide studied Australian operations in Vietnam as case studies in effective counterinsurgency, offering practical lessons for special operations employment. The emphasis on intelligence-led operations, where reconnaissance guided the employment of larger conventional forces, became incorporated into doctrine for special operations forces globally. The integration of small reconnaissance elements with infantry battalions, creating an intelligence operations cycle that made both more effective, entered standard practice for military forces facing irregular warfare challenges. Extended patrol techniques SAS developed. Night ambush tactics they refined through years of practice, and tracking methods they adapted from Aboriginal traditions to Southeast Asian jungle conditions, all became part of the professional knowledge base that special operations communities worldwide drew upon when training their own forces. Modern counterinsurgency doctrine developed through analysis of conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere incorporates principles that Australian forces applied in Phuoc Tuy province decades earlier, and validated through sustained operations that achieved measurable results. The Ma Rung reputation the Viet Cong bestowed upon the SAS endures as a professional standard that special operations forces worldwide aspire to achieve through their own selection, training, and operational discipline. The concept of the Phantom, the force that operates unseen and strikes without warning to achieve effects disproportionate to its numerical strength, captures an ideal that guides special operations employment in contemporary conflicts. The specific techniques continue to evolve with technology and changing tactical environments as new capabilities emerge. The underlying principle that stealth and precision can achieve what mass and firepower cannot in irregular warfare remains validated by the Australian experience and continues to inform how professional military forces approach similar challenges. Academic research mapping thousands of combat incidents from the Vietnam War reveals patterns that individual participants could not perceive during operations when they lacked the broader perspective that statistical analysis provides. Studies confirm that Australian forces achieved favorable contact ratios with 9 successful engagements for every 10 times they encountered enemy forces during operations. The village ambush operations and reconnaissance patrols of the SAS produced measurable effects on enemy capability that large-scale American search and destroy missions did not achieve, despite consuming far greater resources and generating far higher friendly casualty rates. Documentation provides empirical foundation for doctrinal conclusions about effective counterinsurgency that might otherwise rest solely on anecdotal evidence and individual recollections subject to the distortions of memory and bias. Contemporary Special Operations Forces study the Australian SAS experience in Vietnam when developing their own capabilities for irregular warfare and counterinsurgency operations. The lessons about what small professional teams can accomplish through patient application of proven techniques, what intelligence gathering enables in terms of conventional force effectiveness, and what sustained pressure achieves that episodic large operations cannot, remain relevant to military forces facing conflicts where the enemy operates among populations and avoids direct confrontation with superior conventional forces. The Australian withdrawal from Phuoc Tuy province in October 1971 marked the end of one of the more successful Allied military campaigns in the Vietnam War, measured by tactical effectiveness and operational results achieved over sustained periods. 580 soldiers conducting nearly 1,200 patrols over 6 years, achieving kill ratios exceeding 30-1 while suffering only 2 combat deaths, showed what professional forces applying sound tactical principles could accomplish when given operational independence and clear objectives. The methods developed during those 5 years entered the permanent corpus of professional military knowledge and continue to influence special operations doctrine decades later across multiple nations and service branches. The strategic outcome toward which those tactical methods could not contribute sufficiently remains a reminder that war ultimately is not decided by tactics alone, but by the complex interaction of military operations, political will, economic resources, popular legitimacy, and strategic coherence across all elements of national power, working in concert toward common objectives that must be sustainable over time. The lessons the Australian Special Air Service Regiment taught in Vietnam about what small professional forces can accomplish through patient application of sound counterinsurgency principles remain valid. The broader lesson that tactical excellence cannot compensate for strategic incoherence or absence of viable political framework at the national level remains equally valid and perhaps more important for those who would employ military force in conflicts where the fundamental challenges are political rather than military in nature.